My name is Bonnie. And at 30 years old, the ink was still drying on the closing papers when I stepped out onto the deck of my new home in Nag's Head. The breeze that swept across the dunes carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and seaweed, the kind of air that clung to your hair and whispered of untethered freedom. For the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I inhaled deeply, really breathed, as if the oxygen here was mine alone to claim. The house wasn't extravagant, not the kind that turned heads or graced glossy magazines. Its weathered gray shingles told stories of storms survived. Its wide, salt-flecked windows opened toward a stretch of sand that curved lazily to meet the restless Atlantic. But it was mine. Every beam, every scuffed floorboard, every sun-bleached shingle had been paid for with my effort, my sacrifice, my quiet persistence. This place wasn't just shelter, it was a boundary carved out of a lifetime spent standing in someone else's shadow. I had barely set the folder with the deed onto the counter when my phone buzzed. Marcella. My sister's name glowed on the screen like a warning light. I hesitated, only a moment before answering, though I already knew the rhythm her voice would take. "We'll be there in 3 hours," she said. Sharp, clipped, each word carrying the authority of habit. "All 26 of us, my in-laws, the kids, everyone. Clear the rooms. Get meals ready. We're staying 2 weeks." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The call ended before I could reply. I stood there, alone in the center of my unfurnished living room, the sunlight pooling across the bare wood floors, the ocean light flickering like silver on the walls. Her words lingered, bouncing softly around the space that had never known her voice before. That tone, the one that sliced through air like glass, was all too familiar. I'd grown up under it, obeyed it, bent to it until I nearly forgot there was any other way to be. Marcella never asked, she declared, and everyone, myself included, made room for her declarations. But this house was mine. The deed had my name on it, and no one else's. The ink was fresh proof that I had finally stepped beyond the reach of her commands. Outwardly, I stayed composed, letting none of the old tremors return to my voice. "I hear you, Marcella," I had said, steady as stone. But inside, something long dormant began to stir. It was a mix of ache and steel, something both fragile and unbreakable. When I ended the call, I set the phone down carefully and turned toward the horizon. The water beyond the dunes was restless, glittering, alive. I had 3 hours. That was all she had given me. And I already knew, somehow, that 3 hours would be plenty. As the wind murmured through the open windows, my mind drifted backward, carried by the tide of memory to Rayleigh, to the place where Marcella and I had learned who we were expected to be. She was fire. Demanding, dazzling, unyielding. I was Hainara stillness, patient, careful. The peacekeeper who filled the silences. Her storms left behind. If you've ever been betrayed by the people, who were supposed to lift you higher, if you've ever found yourself applauding someone who took what should have been yours, then you'll understand the weight that memory carries. Our parents had encouraged her boldness without meaning to. They called it confidence, charm, leadership. Her tantrums were passion. Her selfishness was spirit. And me? I was the reliable one, the helper, the girl who didn't make trouble. I could still see the birthday table where Marcella demanded the biggest slice of cake and got it, while I smiled and took what was left. The school nights when she bragged about her project, teamwork, though I'd done it all, staying up past midnight to make sure it was perfect. By high school, it was routine. Marcella commanded. I complied. When our parents died, I thought, naively, that grief might change her, that loss might finally humble her. But it only magnified what she already was. She seized control of the estate before the funeral flowers had even wilted. Relatives deferred to her without question, and I, too tired to argue, stepped back, the way I always had. She called it family leadership. I called it erasure. Years passed, and her voice still filled every room we shared. Every time I spoke, it was as though the air thickened, swallowing my words before they reached anyone's ears. And yet, standing in my beach house, with the ocean wind threading through my hair, I felt something different, something close to defiance. This place was untouched by her. The walls had never echoed her footsteps. The deed was mine alone, written in my name, sealed by my hand. I could almost see us as children again. Marcella stamping her foot, me folding my hands to keep them from trembling. But now for the first time the trembling was gone. What replaced it was quiet, deliberate calm. The kind that comes when you realize the story doesn't have to keep ending the same way. When our parents passed, I had believed, foolishly, that responsibility would soften her edges. Instead, she used it as armor. The estate was split on paper, but in practice, everything orbited her authority. The Madkoinit family farm in Johnston County was the first to go. It had been our father's pride, his life's work, a stretch of green and gold that seemed endless in summer. I had wanted to keep it, lease it maybe, or turn it into a cooperative. But Marcella waved the idea away, claiming it was too much upkeep. She'd never set foot in the fields, yet within months the land was sold, bulldozed, parceled, and covered in tract housing. Then came our childhood home in Raleigh, the one with cedar closets and wallpaper that still smelled faintly of my mother's perfume. I had suggested restoring it, preserving the memories before deciding what to do next. Marcella hired contractors before I could finish the sentence. She gutted the place from the inside out. By the time she was done, the house was stripped of everything it had once been, our past erased like pencil marks from a page. And through it all I stayed silent. It was the role I knew best. The beach house, though, that was supposed to be my redemption. My sanctuary. I had bought it after years of double shifts at Duke Regional, saving every spare dollar, living modestly while people assumed I had nothing. When I signed those papers, I thought I had finally outrun her reach. But the call proved otherwise. Marcella didn't need a key to invade. Her weapon had never been possession. It was entitlement. And this time, I refused to hand her the battlefield. If I confronted her head-on, I knew the script. She'd yell, twist my words, cry about being mistreated, and by the end, I'd be painted as ungrateful. I'd been cast in that role too many times. No more. This time I would fight differently. Quietly. I opened the folder I'd carried from the closing office. Inside were scribbled notes, numbers, and contacts I'd gathered just in case. At the time, they'd been preparation for someday. Now, they were my defense. First, I called out a property manager in Nag's Head, a man named Tom, who specialized in vacation rentals. I explained that I needed the house booked immediately, that it was available starting that night. He paused for barely a moment before saying, "You're in luck. I have families waiting for last-minute cancellations." We drafted the contract on the spot. I forwarded the documents and confirmed the payment details. Within the hour, the property would no longer be vacant. Next, I called an catering service in Kill Devil Hills, arranging for dinner delivery that evening, for the incoming guests. Meals for 26, prepaid. Let Marcella have her feast. It would be enjoyed by strangers, not her. Lastly, I contacted a calm moving crew, asking them to be on standby in case I needed help with linens or staging for the rental. They agreed, ready within the hour. With each call, my pulse steadied. No panic, no fear, only precision. For years, I had mistaken silence for weakness. Now I understood it could be strength, sharp, deliberate, and unshakable. Marcella had given me 3 hours. I would use every minute. When I finally set the phone down, the house seemed to shift around me, its stillness no longer hollow. The ocean beyond the windows roared, not as a threat, but as a promise, a reminder that freedom often comes quietly, on the heels of preparation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for her storm to pass. I was building something that would withstand it. I walked through each room slowly, my hand trailing along the smooth walls, grounding myself in the reality I'd created. There were no family photos here, no old echoes, no ghosts of obligation, only space, sunlight, and the scent of sea air, a blank canvas, a new beginning, and this time, Amal would decide what story it held. I paused in the largest bedroom, picturing the view Marcella would have claimed for herself, barking orders while everyone else fell in line. The thought no longer filled me with dread. It only sharpened my resolve. The property manager called back within the hour. A family from Virginia Beach had been desperate for Atway rental and would arrive that evening. They had already wired the deposit, higher than market rate, for the last-minute booking. His tone carried both surprise and respect when I agreed without hesitation. I could hear the clicking of his keyboard as he confirmed the paperwork. The house would be ready, he promised, and he would arrive personally to oversee the handoff. I hung up and walked into the kitchen. The counters gleamed, empty, except for my folder and the stack of papers I had carried from Raleigh. I opened the envelope I had kept hidden for years. Photocopies of withdrawals Marcella had made from the family trust. Transactions written under my name when I was too weary to fight. I remembered the nights I'd come home from Duke Regional after double shifts, smelling of disinfectant and exhaustion while she drained accounts I had helped build. I slid the documents into the fireproof safe I had tucked into a closet. They weren't just records. They were proof that I hadn't imagined the theft, that my silence had a cost. I wasn't ready to toast them, not yet. But knowing they were closed studied me more than the locked door or deed. When I closed the safe and turned the key, I felt the house shift from fragile to fortified. The rooms no longer seemed vulnerable. They felt prepared, and so was I. As the sound of distant tires on the highway reminded me that hours were slipping away, the first car rolled into the driveway just as the sun began its slow dip toward the water. Within minutes, more followed. A caravan of minivans and SUVs spilling onto the street, until the curb was jammed with unfamiliar license plates, doors slammed, voices. Rose and children bolted across the sand path toward the porch as if it already belonged to them. Laughter carried on the wind, too loud for walls that had never held them. Marcella stepped out of the lead car like a commander surveying her conquest. She didn't knock, didn't pause. Instead, she began directing bodies, pointing to the second floor for luggage, waving toward the kitchen for the boxes of groceries they had brought. Her in-laws moved as though rehearsed, hauling coolers and suitcases without so much as a glance in my direction. To them, this house was already theirs for 2 weeks, and I was nothing more than the doorman holding the key. I stood in the entryway, calm, my hands steady at my sides. Years ago, I would have rushed forward to help, to ease the transition, to make myself useful so as not to cause waves. But now I waited, watching as Marcella barked, "Get the children settled upstairs. Leave the wine on the counter. Bonnie, where are the spare linens?" Her eyes flicked past me, already calculating which room she would claim for herself. The largest bedroom, of course, the one with the ocean view. It was the same look I had seen on her face as a girl, when she would stamp her foot until our parents gave her the biggest slice, the better toy, the louder praise. "Don't unload," I said finally, my voice even but clear. The words landed like a stone in water. For the first time since they'd arrived, the noise paused. Suitcases hung midair. A cooler shifted awkwardly in someone's arms. Marcella turned, disbelief flashing into irritation. "What do you mean? Don't unload. This is the house. We're here." I made her stare without flinching. "Not a night, Marcella." The silence stretched taut as a rope pulled to breaking. And in that stillness, I felt the tide of the evening begin to turn. Marcella's eyes narrowed, her voice slicing through the heavy pause. "What are you talking about? Of course we're unloading. Everyone's exhausted from the drive." She snapped her fingers at one of the cousins, urging him toward the staircase. I didn't move. "The house is booked," I said, steady as the tide outside. "Paying guests arrive tonight. You'll need to take your things back to the cars." For a moment, no one reacted, as if my words were in a language they couldn't translate. Then confusion rippled across the group. A few of the in-laws shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, the weight of their coolers suddenly awkward in their arms. One cousin muttered almost under his breath, "We didn't know." Right on cue, the property manager appeared at the end of the drive. Clipboard in hand, his shirt crisp, his stride brisk. He greeted me first, then turned to Marcella with professional detachment. "Ma'am, this property has been reserved. 2 weeks paid in advance at above market rate. I'm here to prepare for the renter's arrival." The whispers grew louder, embarrassment coloring faces that had moments ago been full of laughter. Marcella's expression twisted, disbelief colliding with outrage. "This is ridiculous. We're your family. Strangers don't come before us." I let the silence breathe before answering. "This isn't a family hostel. It's an investment. One I worked for, one I own, and one that will pay for itself starting tonight." A line had been drawn and they could all see it. Some in-laws avoided my eyes. Others stepped back toward their vehicles, shifting from her side to neutrality. The strength of her entourage faltered, and the certainty she always wore like armor began to crack. Marcella looked around, waiting for someone to back her, to echo her outrage. But the crowd behind her was no longer unified. It was splintering, the loyalty she counted on dissolving into awkward silence. Her face flushed crimson as she turned back to me, her voice rising, desperate to reclaim the ground she was losing. But I had already set the stage for what came next. Marcella's fury was rising, her voice pitched sharp enough to cut glass. When I reached into the folder I had carried from Raleigh, I pulled out a plain envelope thick with papers and held it out between us. She hesitated, suspicion flickering across her face before she snatched it from my hand. Her bravado faltered as she flipped through the pages, bank records, copies of trust withdrawals, each line stamped with her signature beside my name, years of siphoning disguised as practical management. I had kept them quietly, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be weakness but weapon. Her hands shook as the papers rattled in the wind. Rage twisted across her features, but underneath it I saw something sharper. Fear. For once, her control was not absolute. "If you ever touch this house," I said evenly, "every dollar you stole becomes public record. Court, community, everyone." I won't stay silent again. A hush fell over the driveway. One of her in-laws, a man I barely recognized, shifted uncomfortably before taking 2 children by the hand, guiding them back toward the car. His eyes met mine briefly, full of apology that wasn't his to give. The sound of a car door closing punctured the tension, reminding everyone this wasn't a family gathering. It was a reckoning. Marcella's voice cracked when she tried to rally, the confident edge slipping. "You wouldn't dare!" she hissed. But it lacked the force it once carried. Her audience was thinning, her power unraveling in the daylight. I stood firm, letting her see the calm in me. She could not shake. She clutched the envelope, desperate and cornered, her fury no longer landing the way it used to. The silence around us wasn't mine alone anymore. It belonged to everyone watching her stumble. And as more relatives edged back toward their cars, I knew the collapse was only beginning. Engines turned over one by one as the caravan began to unravel. Doors slammed, muffled voices carried across the street, and I caught fragments of whispers, remarks about Marcella's arrogance, her habit of taking too much for granted. The crowd that had arrived with such noise and certainty now scattered in quiet retreat, each step away chipping at the authority she had worn like armor. Marcella stood rooted in the driveway, clutching the envelope as if it might vanish if she let go. Her voice rose in jagged bursts, calling after her in-laws, insisting they stay, trying to gather them back under her command. But they kept moving, eyes down, unwilling to return to her side. The children were buckled into cars, coolers shoved hastily into trunks, and one by one, the vehicles pulled away from the house she had thought was hers to claim. As the last of the caravan disappeared, the caterers arrived. Vans unloading trays of food meant for guests who would appreciate them. Movers carried in fresh linens, their step sure and practiced, resetting the house, not for family but for paying tenants. The transition was seamless, as if Marcella's invasion had been nothing more than a brief disturbance in the tide. She screamed then, a raw sound that cracked in the open air. Rage, humiliation, disbelief, all of it spilling into the afternoon light with no one left to catch it. Her power had evaporated, her audience gone, leaving her exposed in a way I had never seen. As I had nothing. I didn't need to. My silence held more weight than her shouting ever could. I had drawn Theline, and this time it held. When I closed the door, the house seemed to exhale with me, already turning toward the quiet I had earned. That night, I carried a chair onto the deck and let the sound of the waves wash through me. The sand shimmered pale in the moonlight, the Atlantic restless but steady, a rhythm older than anything Marcella or I had ever fought over. Above him, the stars stretched wide and sharp, unbothered by the noise of the day. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down, no shadow stretching across my steps. I thought of the girl I had been, the one who yielded, who swallowed her words so that Marcella's could carry. That girl had walked behind her sister in Raleigh kitchens and crowded schoolyards, always the one to smooth the path to absorb thesting. For decades, I had mistaken patience for weakness, silence for safety. But sitting there, the salt air in my face, I understood the truth. I had never been weak. I had been waiting. The house around me wasn't just wood, glass, and paint. It was proof that years of double shifts, frugal choices, and quiet resolve had built something solid. It was a line drawn in cedar and stone, a reminder that I could claim space without apology. Marcella's voice no longer filled the night. Her demands, her certainty, her entitlement had slipped into the past, and with them went the part of me that had always bent. I leaned back, listening to the ocean beat its endless rhythm, and felt the key warm in my pocket. The deed was mine, but more than that, so was Vestery. This house was not just an investment. It was my declaration that I would never again be erased.